Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for the very warm introduction. Thank you for the incredible group of women who have organized this. And thank you for inviting me back. It's such a pleasure to be here. So the topic is one that I think explains the turnout. It's one of the major challenges of our time, which is how do we as parents and as grandparents whose whole focus is on pouring everything into our children and dreaming about our children coming out to reflect and internalize our values, how do we live with their disappointment? How do we live with the fallout from saying no to them? I'm supposed to speak till what time, Peggy? Until I'm through. 2:40, okay, 2:40. At 2:40, I want to designate everybody in this section throw things at me at 2:40, okay? So 2:45, okay, wait, give me 5 minutes grace, great, okay. So I'm going to start a little slow, but I hopefully going to get to some very specific kinds of recommendations. And then I think hopefully we'll get when we'll go from knowledge to skills, we'll be through some role plays, hopefully, from our distinguished panel. I can't think of a more capable group of women than this group. When my wife heard who was on this panel, she pushed for her to be able to come and hear them, and she's heard me a million times. She doesn't need to hear. These people you want to listen to. Okay, number one, let me start with a few words on desirable difficulties, which is something you all know, but I'll just go over some thoughts on it. Hopefully it's chazara, which is basically, if we could construct a world for our children where they never have to deal with frustration, where they never have to deal with the frustration and pain of challenges and our saying no, it would be an unqualified disaster. Kids and adults grow through falling. They grow through that ilu nafalti lo kamti, ilu yashafti bachoshech lo haya orli. If I never fell down, I never would have gotten up. If I never experienced some darkness, I never would have appreciated the light. I'm going to just give you 3 examples of this before I go on to the next main point. The first example is one that I think I might have spoken about briefly in the past. It's the work of Dr. Oliner. Dr. Oliner is a very well-known sociologist. And when he was, I believe, 10 years old, living in a small town in Europe, on one horrible day, the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, took everybody he ever knew, his parents, his grandparents, his neighbors, and his friends, and lined them up and brutally executed them. In the chaos, this little boy runs away, and he finds himself on the outskirts of town, and he knocks on the door, and the door is answered by the owner of the house in this farmhouse on the outskirts of this town. And she and her husband, not only did they immediately take him in and hide him for the remainder of the war, but they treated him like one of their own. They literally made him feel loved and accepted. And we all know what the cost would have been had they been caught. Not only would they have been killed, not only would their children and parents have been killed, but anybody who knew them, anybody with any kind of association with them, would have been brutally murdered. And they cared for him in spite of that. After the war, he's rescued by, I believe, an uncle, grows up in this area, and I believe might have been in the 5 towns. And he grows up and he gets a PhD in sociology, marries a woman who becomes his partner, who has a PhD in sociology, and he spends his entire professional career trying to answer a simple question. What was the parenting like of these moral giants? What distinguished them from what most people would do in this situation? I often thought, what would I have done if I was faced with that? I can't imagine that I would have had the moral heroism to do what he did, to do what they did. And listen to what he, in all of his research studies, and he's written a number of books. You want to know one of the core things that it boils down to? Was a home of a future righteous Gentile. It was all about how mistakes were handled. What happened when this child inevitably messed up? What happened when this future righteous Gentile in their home made a mistake? How were mistakes handled? You know how they were handled? They were handled with a combination of calmness, acceptance, and insistence on the part of their parents that they engage in a tshuva process. And they tell them, we know you're better than this. Let's talk about how to make up for what you did. Let's talk about how to handle this mistake in a way that you grow from it. It wasn't guilt-inducing. It was just believing in them, and combined with believing in them, having them finally hone a sense of moral clarity and chazon. We're in that time of year of chazon, of vision. We need vision in order to have our children internalize our values and keep up with our way of life. Be'ein chazon yifara'am. Without that vision thing, we lose ourselves. And that was the key factor in these homes. So that when this 10-year-old boy, running from the most horrible moment of his life, knocks on the door, they immediately knew the right thing. You know that every righteous Gentile they interviewed didn't understand the question. They said, what do you mean? How could you do what you did? What do you mean, how could we do what we did? How could anybody not do what we did? We know what's right. We were taught what's right. But remember, it's a combination of believing in your child, of expectation, and having the ability to stand by while they experience maybe the frustration and the challenge. Point one on desirable difficulties. By the way, if I was showing you a PowerPoint, okay, or had given you out notes, and I made, let's say, every fifth line blurry and fuzzy, so it's a little bit harder to read, do you know you would remember those lines better than anything else in the handouts? Because anytime we have to struggle, we learn a little better. We master things a little better. Point two on this. It's the work of Dr. Bosk, which I know I've spoken to you about in previous conferences, the neurosurgeon study. Dr. Bosk, sociologist at University of Pennsylvania Medical School. He asked a simple question. What differentiates the top neurosurgeons from the bottom neurosurgeons? The neurosurgeons who are so good that after their years of training, many, many years of training, medical school, all kinds of fellowships and subspecialties, you're not done till you're like in your mid-30s, or it takes a long time. And what that differentiates the best ones in this incredibly competitive field that lose the fewest patients and have the best outcomes from the bottom 1% who are so bad at what they do that they get fired from their jobs at the hospital. And it's not what you'd think. You might think it's manual dexterity. You might think that it's the medical school or the residency or fellowship training program they went to. It's none of those things. You know what the main differentiator of top 1% from bottom 1%? It's how they handle their mistake. If a top 1% neurosurgeon, chas v'sholem, lost a patient, he or she would not go home till they figured out how to change setback to feedback. They'd go to the library for hours. Did I miss some new development? They'd call the leading neurosurgeons around the country. Help me do it better next time. They'd go to the animal lab and do the surgery over and over again on those poor animals. And they wouldn't rest, often being up all night, till they were able to figure out how to grow from their mistake. The bottom 1%, it's chilling, absolutely chilling to read the transcripts of Dr. Bosk's interview with them. They'd say, of course I lost that patient. If you had such incompetent nurses helping you, you also would have lost the patient. Or the hospital has such terrible lighting, why don't they pay their electric bill? It's all about externalizing our blame. Our children can't grow unless they face that simple challenge of helping them learn how to grow from their mistakes, helping them learn how to change setback to feedback, and helping them not externalize blame. I know it's not always easy. Sometimes we have children with a personality that's not like that, but that's key. Okay? That's point 2 on this. And then the final point on this is the story of Keith Jarrett. And then I'll go on to the next category. Keith Jarrett, okay? It's the 9 days, so you can't look into this until after Tisha B'Av. But listen to this, okay? Keith Jarrett, to this day, is considered one of the leading jazz piano musicians in the world. One day in 1975, Keith Jarrett had to play at a huge concert for many thousands in Cologne, Germany. He comes early in the morning, way before the concert, something like 10 hours before the concert, to try out the concert piano. And he sees that it's a disaster. The concert piano absolutely is not concert worthy. All of the pads on the left-hand side don't make music. Okay, there's nothing there. You could hit the keys all you want, no music. All the pads on the right-hand side, nothing there, no music. The middle keys make music a little bit, but out of key, and really you can't hear very much. So he tells the young woman who was in charge of arranging the concert, very young woman, 19 years old, I believe. He says, look, you have to go and find me a replacement piano. I can't do it on this. So she runs out. You can't get a concert-level piano on such short notice in that part of Europe. So she comes back, and he says, look, I'm afraid I have to cancel the concert. She's barely out of her adolescent years. She's devastated. She thinks she's not going to be so embarrassed. My life will be over. And you have to understand one more thing about Keith Jarrett. He was a real kanoi about wanting to perform only on ideal conditions. He was such a meshugana about this that when he would perform in, let's say, Carnegie Hall in Manhattan, he would go to the audience before the concert, always sold out, and he'd give out cough drops because he didn't want anybody to cough. You weren't allowed to cough in his concert. He was a little bit of a meshugana. And this man somehow felt so badly for this young adolescent that he said to her, for you, I'll play. And he goes on to play with this totally messed up piano, what has become what many people consider to be one of the finest concert piano pieces in history. It sold more albums than any other concert piano piece. It is, I think, holds the record for an all-time best-selling piece of music, period, okay, with this piano. And you could download it, not now, but after Yontif, after Tisha B'Av, when we move on, okay? It's called, you just Google Jarrett Cologne Concert 1975, and you could buy the piece of music. It is magnificent, it's haunting, it's beautiful. Why? The challenge brought out a level of creativity and brilliance that this brilliant man never reached until then. The greatest gift we could give our children is the gift of having them learn how to face frustration and grow from frustration. Part 2 is something that you've heard me talk about in the past, but I'll go over it. And that's basically the idea that we're living in an age where, in the balance between love and limits, parents are experts on love in this generation and even in the previous generation. It's been going on for quite some time now. We're not so good at limits. We're not so good at saying no. Yet, what we know from Chazal and what we know from many, many sources, all love, no limits. Our kids grow up to be overindulged. All limits, no love. It's not good either. Rules without relationships equals rebellion. We need the middle. We need to find the middle path. It's called authoritative parenting. And it's an art, because it's not going to be the same for any one of your children. I'm sure when we get to questions and role plays, we'll realize it all depends on your child's temperament. And what's right in this balance for one child isn't what's right for another child. As I said last year, the brilliant words of the Kutzker captures it. There is nothing as unequal, the Kutzker said, as the equal treatments of children. Say it again. There's nothing as unequal as the equal treatment of children. We have to find it, and we have to realize that our kids grow from the no. Let me share with you just a quick story that some of you may have heard, but it just captures it for me. There was a boy I was seeing, he was about 15 years old. His parents were wonderful people, but they were love specialists. Came from a modern Orthodox family, wonderful, loving family, but they didn't know how to say no, and he was getting more and more out of control, and I was getting nervous about him. I was really nervous because he was beginning to act out more and more and more, and I was worried that he was about to slip into more and more drug use. I was worried that he was about to slip into even more dangerous behavior. At one point, I became really worried because he told me that he was picking up some extra cash by beginning to deal drugs. He had absolutely no brakes ever put on him. So I called his parents into my office one day. I put him, I told him I was going to do this, and I said, look, I'm very worried. You have to really have clearer limits for your kid. And they realized it was time. So they took away his platinum American Express card. It's child abuse in my neighborhood, by the way, to take that away. They took away basically his rights to go out on school nights. They really read to him very clear limits till he earned their trust again. And he was going crazy. He turned red, he started screaming, started to have a tantrum. And I was worried that he was going to physically attack his father, who had never said no to him before. Never said no to him before. So I quietly asked the father, please go out into the waiting room, I want to talk to him. They go out into the waiting room, and the child realizes they're out of earshot, and he calls me over, and he whispers in my ear, it's about time. It's about time. And that's exactly what Chazal tell us. That's what the Pasuk in Mishlei says. Yaser bincha ki yesh tikva ve'el hamiso al tite nafshecha. Put limits on your child, there's always hope. And don't pay attention to their yelling, screaming, and crying. And the Medrash on this says, Kol hamosif av yisurin al beno. The more a father puts limits on his child, mosif haben ahava alaviv. The child will love the parent. And I can't tell you how often. Years later, I had a mother tell me not too long ago about one of her children who had a tough temperament, and she went crazy anytime she was strict, especially if she was strict in areas that her daughter said, look, all my friends are allowed to do this or allowed to do that, which is rarely true, but she would always say it, and she was always bitterly unhappy and complaining about it. After she became an adult, after she grew up, this daughter herself now has many of her own children, thank God, and she is much stricter with her children than any of her siblings are with their children. And she always goes to her mother and says, Mommy, I just want to tell you, I can never thank you enough for how strict you were with me. Countless times I have children come back from learning a number of years in Eretz Yisrael, and they'll say, how did my parents allow me to do this or that when I was in high school? Why did they say yes to this? Why did they say yes to that? And they have tainas. And on many times in my office, I've had children who would have tantrums in my office when they were younger because their parents said no, and they come back to me with their children, with their adolescent children. They'll come back to me with their teenagers. It's the next generation, okay? Be careful when you tell your children, I only hope that one day you'll have a child just like this, because it happens and it's your grandchild. And they'll come back to me with that child, and guess what? They'll say to me, I remember 20, 30 years ago when I had a tantrum right there in that office, on the floor of that office. Even then, I was happy that my parents were saying no. Even then, I knew that that was the right thing. Don't go just by the short term. Go by the long term. Our children need it. They need the balance. They need the brilliant wisdom of Chazal, the wisdom that says that we have to say no. And that's one of the other core points I wanted to talk about. Point 3 is the point of affluenza. I think it's important to talk about affluenza. I don't remember if I did it in the past. Did I ever do it? Here's affluenza. Affluenza is a term coined by Dr. Sonia Luther, who's the head of the clinical psychology program at Columbia. And she did a fascinating study. Listen to this. She goes to Scarsdale, New York. And she wanted to show how being wealthy should protect our children from serious emotional and behavioral problems. So she looked at a group of wealthy Scarsdale kids on a bunch of variables, expecting to find protection, compare them to kids on the other side of the tracks in Scarsdale, and she was shocked to find triple the rate of depression in the rich kids, triple the rate of alcohol and substance abuse in the wealthy kids, and triple the rate of anxiety in the wealthy kids. She couldn't believe it. So she did another series of studies to break down, to deconstruct, what are the active ingredients behind affluenza. She found 3 things, each of which becomes a recommendation as you address this issue. Number 1, she found it's never enough just to be average in Scarsdale. In Scarsdale, so obviously a more modern kind of, it's a secular community, you don't go to shul on Shabbos morning to brag about your kid getting just in the 50th percentile on, on SATs or whatever college admission or graduate school admission tests. We don't brag about what's average. You have to excel. And because of that, the uniqueness becomes gone. We have to allow our kids to find their excellence in the area of their uniqueness, in their unique gift, to fan the flames of the unique tune that makes their soul sing with their signature strengths. That's number 1. Number 2, she found time. The parents were around, but they often outsourced their parenting. They'd hire coaches. They'd hire tutors. They'd hire childcare. They were there, but they weren't really there. They were often either looking down on their phone or totally absorbed in whatever was going on in their lives. We're not going to talk about digital challenges like we did last year, but you all know what I'm talking about here. And without time, you can't thrive. That's the currency through which kids internalize our values. It's being there in eye-to-eye, face-to-face contact with your kid that's going to protect them from the stresses of life. And the third was giving. The kids in Scarsdale, you know why they were at greater risk? They took. They didn't give. They didn't have to do chores. They had housekeepers to do their chores. They didn't have to clean up after themselves on a Shabbos morning or on any morning. Why do that? There are housekeepers to do that. They didn't have to do any of that stuff. Why should they? Not good. In order to live, in order to thrive, in order to grow your neshama, you have to do chores, you have to help out, you have to give, because that's an engine of building up your inner self. Olam chesed yibana. You know, when you give, you get back. And that's so central. The need to assign our kids to do chores and to give and to help out. Just sharing a story about a related component, about how sometimes we treat our kids like royalty. It's just so upsetting. So I told a story I had forgotten about. It happened many years ago. And it came flashing in my head as we were preparing for this at lunch today. Listen to this story. It's even true. This is one of the true stories I'll tell you, okay? My father, Olav Shalom, wanted to come to a grandson's graduation, and it happened to be in a yeshiva that my father was very active in starting. Some people credited him for starting that yeshiva maybe 70 years earlier in building up the Far Rockaway Five Towns community. It was a big graduation. My father had a bad balance problem then, but he wanted to come. He pushed himself. So I took him, and it was outside on this large lawn. And we get there, and he's on his walker, barely able to walk, and I'm supporting him. And all the seats were either taken with children or by parents who were saving the seats for the other children who were on the other part of the lawn playing. So I go over to one of them, I say, excuse me, my father needs to sit down. It's hard for him to stand. You have to understand, many people would say it's questionable that without his effort, there'd even be a school the kids were graduating that day. And he was in his 90s. He was old, and he was frail. And they said, no, that's for my son, my daughter, the kids, grandchildren are here. Not a single person made their kids stand up to give kavod. Forget anything, forget whatever my father's role was as the Rav in that community for about 70 years, or for 65 years. Forget all of that. Forget the fact that he was a man, an old man in his 90s who just needed a seat. Nobody would give up their seat. So I turned to him, he turned to me. I said, okay, Dad, I can take you home. Took him home, and then, he felt terrible that he couldn't see his grandson graduate, but he missed the graduation, Not such a crazy story. I don't know if any of you have experienced this, where your kids get the seat before you do. Okay, you stand and they sit. That's a chutzpah yaska. It's a turned around kind of world. We can't allow that. That's a terrible lesson for our children. It's a terrible lesson for our children. So that's that point. And then I wanted to talk now, let's get to specific recommendations and then a concluding story. Here's some specific recommendations. Number one is to remember that in setting limits for our children, the kind of consequences that work best have the following three characteristics. They're calm, they're calmly delivered. Our kids not going to hear them. Remember Olener. They're calmly delivered. You did this, so because of that, there's going to be, I may even ask you, what do you think is the logical consequence for what you did in terms of consequences? But it has to be done calmly, okay? Whatever consequence you decide to come up with has to have the second ingredient, logical. It has to make sense. If it feels arbitrary to your son or daughter, it's not going to work. If it makes sense to them, I often find that if you ask the child, what do you think are reasonable consequences, they'll often be tougher on themselves than you would be. So it has to be logical, it has to be calm, and very important, it has to be short. short-lived. You don't ground your child for the rest of their life. It's actually tafasta meruba lo tafast. It's more effective sometimes if the consequence is only for a day or so. You know, depending on what you think makes sense. Paradoxically, that tends to work better. And I'll just end this piece with, I'll hold that off till the end. Okay. So calm, logical, and brief. Next, how do you handle incessant kvetching and lawyering on the part of your child if you say no to them, right? Who has, and I see from the knowing smiles on many faces, that there are such children in the parents in this audience, right? That does happen. How do you handle that? And it differs for each child. But I'll just share with you a beautiful, very helpful thought that's been helpful to many parents from a Dvar Torah of Rav Henoch Leibowitz Zatzal, in the Rosh Yeshiva Chafetz Chaim, last generation. Here's what he says. He talks about Avram on the way to the Akedah. He's taking Yitzchak to the Akedah. And Samael, an agent of the Satan, comes and says, "Old man, are you out of your mind? What are you doing? You're going to go and sacrifice your child? Don't you know you'll never get another chance at having a child?" And Avram answers, "Amanas Cain, even so." Keeps going, the Satan. He says, "Don't you realize that when your wife hears about what happened to your son, out of fright and out of grief, she'll die?" As Medrash tells us. Avram answers, "Amanas Cain." And Samuel keeps going, one argument after another after another. And each time, Avram answers, "Amanas Cain, even so." So Rav Henoch asks, wait a second. Avram had the greatest excuse in the history of man. The greatest excuse ever. Okay? I'm on a mission from God. Hashem sent me. That's the greatest excuse ever. Why not just say, I'm going because Kadosh Baruch Hu told me to? Has anybody have a better excuse in history? I don't think so. Why did he do it? So he answers brilliantly. Because in dealing with the Satan, any excuse would engender an argument. Any answer he would have given the Satan room to keep going and going and going. And sometimes, I know it's a different analogy, but not so different. Sometimes the answer for our children is just no. After we explain to them once, we let it be. That's it. We explained it to them. Our children are bright. And when they keep pushing, yeah, but there's this and there's that, you say, Amanas Cain. We'll explain to them even so. The practical techniques are, the rule of three is one helpful technique. The rule of three is, you say, look, you could ask, I hear what you're saying, I explained it to you already once, okay? You could ask 3 more times, that's fine. First time they ask, you say, oh, okay, that's once. You don't answer again. You just say, that's once. Second time, you calmly say, oh, that's 2 times. You get 1 more. Whenever you get a chance, you get 1 more. Third time they ask, you say, okay, that's 3 times. From now on, I'm not gonna answer. We already discussed this. Not in anger, maybe even with a little bit of humor. They may laugh. They're gonna test you. But that sometimes works. It sometimes is helpful. I know that the reality of you have a kid who has a lot of negative persistence isn't always so simple, but that, it used to be called the broken record technique. Broken record, where you say over and over again the same answer. No, because of this. No, because of this. I can't say broken record technique anymore because nobody knows what a record is. I'll explain it to, ask anybody who's older here, you could ask them what a record is. Okay. Now, let me come to some concluding thoughts. Thought number 1 is some concluding stories. Oh, and I have to talk about old people. I have to talk about old people. Okay, let's go to thought number one. Thought number one has to do with the Kruvim, right? We're in the 9 days. And there's a famous question on the 9 days that at the time of the Churban, the time of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's greatest anger at us, greatest Hester Panim, greatest looking away, when the conquerors of the Beis Hamikdash came to destroy the Beis Hamikdash, they were met by the Kruvim not looking away, but they were looking at each other, almost hugging each other. Pneihem ish el echav kanfeim parsim lamala, right? They were literally looking at each other with love as their protective wings were hovering in a protective way. And the obvious question asked by many Mefarshim is, what are you talking about? This is the time, there was ever a time that the Kruvim should have been looking away. It should have been now. And the answer is because during the time of our greatest punishment, the impact of which we feel to this day, at that time, it was done with love. It was done with connection, and it was done with protection. And that's the way we have to think about limit setting. We have to think about it as basically the lesson of the Kruvim. Here's concluding story, and then we'll move on. I didn't talk about specific recommendations about money. One of the things that I did want to talk about briefly is the idea that this isn't only for our young children. So for our young children, it's fine to say no. We have to help them understand what are they looking for when they're asking for things and stuff, and what does money stand for? When do we say yes? When do we say no? What kind of lessons do we want to give about money? But also, what about when our children are old enough to move on and to go get married and to go off to learn in Eretz Yisrael? It never ends. It's not like then we don't have any responsibility to them, okay? And at that point, very often, we face decisions like how much rent do we want to pay for their apartment in Eretz Yisrael? Are we going to keep giving them money in an unqualified way, or do we put some limits on it? Do we know how to say yes and how to say no even when they're adults, and how to say it intelligently since it might impact on shidduchim? I'm hoping we'll have at least one or two role plays on that a little bit later. And let me end with a story. When I was a kid, there were, it's an uncomplicated life. And in the school I went to, in the yeshiva I went to back in the day, many years ago, everybody stayed on the derech. Everybody. Everybody stayed pretty connected. But, however large our class was, there were 3 boys who I remember had always been kicked out, who had always been problems, who had always been terrible students. Back then we didn't have fancy ADHD, we didn't have any of those alphabet letters kind of diagnoses. We didn't, they were just seen as bad kids or whatever. And those 3 kids we lost sight of. Everybody else we knew, It's a very close-knit class and everybody stayed connected, even into adulthood. 3 kids, we didn't know what happened. And let me tell you the story of what happened one Shabbos with 2 of the kids and how it happened. I was in California. I was scholar in residence in an affluent community in California. And I'm sitting with a host who had been my classmate going to yeshiva. And sitting next to him, and I see in the back a guy who I almost could guarantee you was one of the three. He just looked like he might have been the same person. It was many years later. I said, "Is that who I think it is?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "What happened to him? We never knew what happened to him. What's he doing here? He's in shul. He has two little kids running around." I said, "What happened to him?" He says, "I don't know." He wasn't a very psychologically minded my host. He says, "I don't know. He was a great businessman, a wonderful man, but he never thought." He said, "I never asked him. I don't know. He's here, came to shul. He's, part of the community." I had heard that he was involved in all kinds of illegal activities, that he was involved with a non-Jewish woman, I heard bad stuff about him. I wasn't going to let it go. So after shul, I go running over to him, and I say, Yossi, remember me from the old country, And he says, "Yeah, of course." He says, "It was nice to hear you speak, whatever." I said, what happened? What brought you? I heard you went on to all kinds of things not connected to our community. What are you doing here in shul with little kids? Are those your kids? He says, "Yeah, they're my kids." I said, "What happened?" And he smiled, and he looks at me, and he says, "You know something? My father never gave up. He just never gave up. No matter how rebellious I became, he's figured out a way to stay connected with me. No matter how off the derech I went, he stayed connected. He didn't agree with what I was doing, but he managed to still convey to me that he loved me." Like the Kruvim looking at each other, okay? Here's where the story becomes mystical and much harder to believe. This is true. Next day, I was giving a talk with Wendy Mogul, the author of the well-known parenting book, Blessing of a Skinned Knee. Very well-known parenting expert. And it was on the stage of this really beautiful auditorium where this school was. It used to be Fred Astaire's dance studio, famous landmark place. And I'm standing giving the talk, the last talk. She spoke before me. And I see in the back of the auditorium, I see a guy who I'm convinced is the second guy. And I think I must be hallucinating. What are the odds? The second guy is here, and maybe I'm primed to see him. I thought I must be losing my mind. But I wasn't going to let this get away from me. So I finished my talk, and like a madman, I jump off of the high stage. I was younger then. I was able to jump off the high stage. I go running to the back, and I say, Moshe, are you who I think you are?" And he said, I didn't think you'd recognize me. He said, "Yeah." I said, He said, "Yeah, that's me." I said, "What are you doing here? What are you doing here?" And he looks at me a little shy, and he said, "Yeah, it's true. He was involved with, I heard he was a pornography distributor or something. He was like really not in a good place, not in a good place." And I said, "What happened? What? I see you're here." He says, "Yeah, I have kids in the school." I said, "What do you mean you have kids in the school? I heard that you were doing all kinds of other things." And he looks at me, and here's what he said. And with this, I'll end my talk. He says, "You know something? My mother never stopped holding my hand. My mother never stopped holding my hand. We can have limits. We could say no matter how difficult it is to say no. But we have to remember, in thinking about the long trajectory of our children's life, ultimately it has to be done with love, it has to be done with logic, and it has to be done with connection." Thank you, everybody.